Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be there with you tonight to talk about this fascinating topic of breast implant surfaces. I am, first of all, thank you, of course, to Silly France for the invitation. I am very sorry not to have a good Spanish, not enough to talk in Spanish today. So my colleague Giovanna will help me with translation.
Hola a todos, voy a hacer la traducción de Christophe Gomes. Entonces vamos a hablar sobre los nuevos desarrollos en las texturas de los implantes EVAN.
To begin, just a little bit of history. You all know this lady. She was the first lady with a breast implant in '62. And at that time, all implants were smooth. As you know, this new surgery was an immediate success, but very quickly, we noticed that up to 50% of patients had capsular contracture, which was obviously not acceptable. Some years after, some manufacturers began to coat the implants with polyurethane foam. And what we noticed is a drastically reduced rate of capsular contracture. So that was the good aspect. But the bad aspect was that we noticed other complications as infection, rash, and so on. One of the reasons why that the polyurethane was shown to degrade over time. So the idea came to the manufacturers to not to use polyurethane foam onto the implant, but to texture the silicone of the shell itself. And finally, at the end of the 90s, the manufacturers were looking for even more rough textures because we needed to avoid rotation of the implants.
Entonces, en 1962 sale el primer implante en gel de silicona. Hasta los años 70 fue muy popular, pero hubieron 50% de casos de contractura capsular. Entre 1975 y 1985 salieron a la venta los implantes en poliuretano, que redujeron drásticamente los casos de contractura capsular, pero otras complicaciones fueron descritas como inflamaciones, infecciones y piel roja. Entonces, los industriales comenzaron a pensar en crear una textura sobre la envoltura de silicona de los implantes. A fines de los 90 es el desarrollo de los implantes anatómicos con una textura más áspera con el objetivo de evitar la rotación del implante.
As you know, since the very beginning, there is a lot of literature about breast implant, and the topic of smooth versus textured implant has been studied in a lot of details. And even maybe 1 or 2 years ago, until 1 or 2 years ago, all studies, I mean, nearly all studies led to the same conclusion. There was a big consensus that textured implant will lower the risk of capsular contracture. And most publications did agree with that. And you can see on this screen literature reviews and meta-analysis, and all conclude the same. Textured implant would lead to less capsular contracture.
Desde finales de los años 90 ha habido una considerable investigación sobre el tema del efecto de la textura en la prevención de la contractura capsular. Y debemos decir que hubo un amplio consenso sobre el hecho de que la textura reduciría el riesgo de contractura capsular. Tienen aquí el ejemplo de 3 artículos importantes de la literatura publicada o meta-análisis, todos concluyendo que el riesgo de contractura capsular es menor con texturas. Estos artículos son un condensado de muchos estudios.
But since a few months or since a few years, we see now new literature reviews, new articles leading to different conclusions. And now we see more and more clinical data showing that no, there is no significant difference in the rate of capsular contracture between smooth and textured implant. So there is kind of controversy about the topic. And that's a bit strange because, I mean, it's not like rocket science. This question, yes or no, it leads to lower capsular contracture rate. It's a very basic question, but it looks like today this question is not really answered.
Pero es muy interesante que desde hace algunos meses cada vez más publicaciones cuestionen estos hallazgos. Estos 2 estudios a gran escala, por ejemplo, no encuentran ningún riesgo incrementado de contractura capsular con implante liso. Entonces, ¿qué hay de malo allí? ¿Cómo podemos tener conclusiones tan diferentes sobre una pregunta científica tan básica? ¿La textura sí o no impide obtener contractura capsular?
And it's exactly the same with anaplastic large cell lymphoma. As you know, there are more and more cases of anaplastic large cell lymphoma all over the world. In this map, you can see the cases all around the world in the different countries, and that was published last year.
Tengo la misma observación sobre el linfoma anaplástico de células grandes. Aquí tiene un mapa de la situación mundial sobre el linfoma publicado el año pasado.
And looking at some national authorities, they have been publishing the number of cases and the number of deaths. And now they are converging, let's say, to an estimate of risk, which is 1 case for 20,000 patients. That's the approximate conclusion that the authorities are all converging to now. And the mortality rate is about 5%. So they all agree with that risk, but there is one subject they don't agree on: is should we ban or not macrotexture? In some countries, like in France, there is no macrotexture anymore. It's banned, and it's also banned in other countries in the world. But again, how can there be such a difference between some countries that consider that the risk is too high with macrotexture, and other countries which do not consider that the risk is too high and who consider that the risk-benefit ratio is still positive?
El número de casos ha ido en constante aumento, pero parece que estamos entrando en un estado de equilibrio, donde el riesgo ha sido estimado por algunas agencias que están de acuerdo en un caso sobre 20.000 en implantes texturizados. La tasa de mortalidad parece converger en torno del 5%. Algunas agencias han estado prohibiendo los implantes macrotexturados, mientras que la mayoría todavía considera que el beneficio es superior al riesgo. ¿Por qué no hay un consenso sobre las macrotexturas en el mundo?
So we can consider that today there are 2 big controversies around breast implant texture. So the first one is, does yes or no texture provide protection against capsular contracture? And does really macrotexture lead to higher risk of ALCL? So that are 2 big questions, and they are not totally answered today. And that's very strange because, again, that are quite basic scientific questions. So I will show you on the next slide just one image showing that we cannot really answer these questions.
Así que aquí están las 2 principales controversias, en mi opinión, sobre las texturas. Ahora les mostraré una imagen que por sí misma mostrará claramente que no hay respuesta sí o no a estas 2 preguntas.
So what you can see on the screen now is all different textures available onto the European market. So as you can see, they are all so different. So how can we imagine that we can draw a conclusion about yes or no, it decreased the rate of capsular contracture, and yes or no, it increased the risk of ALCL? These 2 questions cannot have an answer until you consider textures as a whole. All textures are different and they lead to different risk of capsular contracture and different risk of ALCL. So any conclusion about textures in general does not make sense according to me.
Aquí está una imagen con todas las texturas disponibles solo en el mercado europeo. Solo con esta imagen, ¿cómo puede alguien tratar de hacer alguna conclusión sobre la contractura capsular en general, siendo en relación con el riesgo de contractura capsular o el riesgo de linfoma? Como pueden ver, hay diferentes texturas, no solamente hay una.
So this observation that the risk of capsular contracture is different between the different texture, it's something that is known since a long time, because this was published by the FDA many years ago, because the 2 first brands in the USA, they did studies, similar studies to evaluate the risk of complication, and the risk of capsular contracture with brand A was 3 times more than the risk of capsular contracture with brand B. So it makes it obvious that all textures don't lead to the same risk of capsular contracture.
Por supuesto, hay evidencia masiva en la literatura de que todas las texturas no conducen al mismo riesgo de contractura capsular. Aquí encontrará los resultados de 2 estudios básicos de la FDA relacionados con 2 estudios de 2 fabricantes estadounidenses. 2 estudios, un diseño de estudio similar, mismo objetivo de población, pero 3 veces más contractura capsular con un implante en comparación con el otro.
Then if you look at this Australian study looking at all cases of ALCL occurring in Australia and New Zealand, again comparing 2 brands, the same brands, so we can see that with one surface, the risk is 14 times higher to get ALCL than with the other surface. So again, different texture will lead to very different risk of ALCL.
La misma historia, mismas marcas con el linfoma. Este estudio australiano muy conocido trae alta evidencia de que algunas texturas tienen 14 veces mayor riesgo de provocar linfoma que otras texturas.
So what it means is that it's the manufacturer duty to bring some clinical evidence about all kind of implant surface they bring to the market, because all surfaces are different. They bring different advantages and different drawbacks. They have different rate of complications. So it's the manufacturer duty to look at all these complications and to make studies to evaluate them. On this image, let's talk a little bit about Sebin. On this image, you can see all textures available at Sebin. And as far as I know, we are the only company with 4 different surfaces available on our products.
Por último, considero que es deber de los industriales de proporcionar pruebas sobre la seguridad de todas las texturas que producen. Hablemos un poco de Sebin. Por lo que sé, somos el fabricante con el mayor número de texturas posibles. Y aquí en la imagen pueden ver las 4 texturas que proponemos.
Then looking at textures classification, I know that the marketing teams of the companies have a lot of imagination to find funny names for their textures, or some call it nano texture and some call it with different names. But actually, there is an ISO standard to classify the texture. So if we want to remain with a scientific approach, we need to call them by the names given by the ISO classification. So if you look at that, Sebin has 2 textures classified into the smooth range, 1 texture classified in the micro texture range, and 1 texture classified in the macro texture range, which is the anatomical implant.
Los equipos de marketing tienen mucha imaginación para calificar sus texturas. Pero si tratamos de volver a los datos científicos, en realidad hay una norma internacional que da directivas sobre la manera de cómo llamar los implantes. En cualquier superficie entre 0 y 10 micrones debe considerarse lisa. Es el caso de 2 superficies producidas por Sebin. Teníamos que nombrar una de ellas semilisa para evitar confusiones. Volveré a esta textura más tarde. Cualquier textura entre 10 y 50 micrones debe considerarse como texturada y tenemos una superficie en este caso. Cualquier textura de más de 50 micrones es considerada como macrotexturada y es el caso de los implantes anatómicos de Sebin.
Then how to get a texture onto the implant? There are a lot of different ways to do it. You can use salt, you can use sugar, gas, polyurethane foam, etc. And you can also use a technique which is mold replication, and that's the one I will talk about now. But it's important to know that the manufacturing technique is not linked to a given surface classification. Using salt, you can make a surface classified as smooth, microtexture, or macrotexture. So there is no link between the fact of using salt, for example, and the classification of the texture.
Hay muchas maneras de producir una textura en un implante. La técnica de fabricación no está vinculada a una determinada clasificación de superficie. Puede ser sal, azúcar, gas, poliuretano, impresión sobre la envoltura. Por ejemplo, usando la técnica de la sal, puedes hacer una textura suave, una micro o una macrotextura, dependiendo de cómo lo hagas. Pero me gustaría centrar mi charla en la textura más reciente que obtenemos por replicación de moldes.
So this is the most recent texture that we put on the market. So this is the one that we call semi-smooth because it is smooth by the classification, but we need to make a difference with the purely smooth implant, so we want to avoid confusion. So this is obtained by mold replication. That means that we create a pattern onto the mold, and then when we dip the mold in the silicone, there is a duplication of the pattern of the mold onto the silicone. And what you can see on the silicone is the same pattern that is on the mold. And this brings a roughness of about 6 microns and 15 pixels per square millimeter.
Entonces aquí vamos a hablar del implante semiliso. Esto significa que creamos un patrón en el molde del implante y luego el patrón se duplica en la silicona del envoltorio. Crea una rugosidad de aproximadamente 6 micrones con 15 picos por milímetro cuadrado.
And because it's a new texture that we have been putting in the market, so we did our duty and we made clinical studies in order to evaluate its safety and effectiveness. What we did first is a genomic analysis of 31 capsules taken from women, from volunteers. And we have been analyzing these capsules in terms of inflammatory reaction. So we have been looking into the genes. Some are associated to the extracellular matrix and some associated to the inflammatory response. And we have been comparing the capsules around this new semi-smooth texture and comparing it to the genetic expression of the capsules around macro texture. And what this study showed very clearly is that the semi-smooth surface, this new one, is associated to a very low inflammatory reaction when compared to the macro-textured implant. And this was published in the PRS journal.
Como fabricante, hicimos nuestra tarea y realizamos estudios clínicos para evaluar el resultado de esta nueva superficie, pero analizamos el perfil genómico de 31 cápsulas formadas alrededor de diferentes superficies, incluyendo nuestra superficie semilisa. Encontramos evidencia de una baja respuesta inflamatoria en comparación con los implantes macrotexturados. Este estudio es publicado en la revista PRS, Plastic Reconstructive Surgery.
And finally, we also ran an international multi-center 10-year prospective study. So that means a big one with 15 investigators across Europe, over 900 patients involved in the study. And if we look at the primary augmentation patient, some patients had semi-smooth implants, some had micro-textured, and some had macro-textured implants. And if you look at the rate of capsular contracture after 3 years, so the rate of capsular contracture after 3 years was 0% in the semi-smooth implant family. So we were able to show that the semi-smooth surface is associated to a lower rate of capsular contracture. So again, this is scientific data. This is not just a marketing argument. This is all data that was published or communicated in congresses.
Luego iniciamos un estudio prospectivo multicéntrico con 15 investigadores en toda Europa, 900 pacientes involucrados, para comparar la tasa de contractura capsular entre poblaciones con diferentes tipos de implantes con diferentes superficies. En pacientes de aumento primario, la superficie semilisa fue la que destacó el menor riesgo de contractura capsular.
So as a conclusion, the breast implant controversies will continue as long as we try to put textured implant to consider it as a single entity. So if we continue to have debates around textured implant in general, we will never find any answer to the question, because textured implant as an entity does not exist. All textures are so different, and it's the manufacturer duty for each new surface they put in the market to bring clinical evidence. We cannot put a texture in the market today without strong clinical evidence. That's why the collaboration between clinician and industry is key, of course, because all the clinical data I have been presenting was gathered together with clinician, of course. And the semi-smooth surface created by mold replication, the very last on the market that we saw some slides ago. It's showing high evidence of very high biocompatibility and low rate of capsular contracture when compared to more aggressively textured implants.
Entonces, en conclusión, las controversias sobre los implantes mamarios continuarán mientras se intenta tratar a los implantes texturizados como una sola entidad. La colaboración entre los médicos y los industriales es clave para recopilar datos clínicos. Nuestra superficie semilisa, creada por replicación de moldes, mostró evidencia de una alta biocompatibilidad y baja tasa de contractura capsular.
And that's it. So thank you again for your attention, and thank you very much to Giovanna for the translation. Bye-bye.
Muchas gracias a todos. Adiós.